to start with a little rap. Oh, in case you missed it, this is the cap of the world champion Kansas City Chiefs.
All right, and you gotta say government, you know? Wait till hell Texas Tech.
This is about you guys. What the people need are schools. Schools that follow all the rules. Rules on how to be the best, how to teach beyond the test. They need teachers who can show what to do and what to know and how to find your place in life and use God's gift to do what's right. We need to teach our people well, push our students to excel, need to use our federal aid to help our students make the grade. They need me and they need you at our best in all we do. Need to use our federal aid to help our students make the grade. And the good news I can share is that your schools are ones who care. I know you set the bar up high, help your students reach the sky. I know you teach your staff this creed that every student should succeed. That's what really makes you shine. Their future is always on your mind. So we celebrate your schools for going far beyond the rules, helping students make them number one when it all is said and done. Thank you. And of course, being number one in Kansas City right now is the thing to do. All right. That's about as entertaining as this is going to get. Sorry about that. We're going to talk about some of the things that Sharon talked about. Change is primarily the theme. There's always change. Many of you have been here for many years, to Larry's conference, and before that, the Region 6 conference that was operated by other folks that are part of Region 6. So we're in 2020, we're in a new decade. Sometimes we all need a change from time to time, like this slide tells us. And like this slide says, sometimes change takes a long time. In Kansas City, we waited 50 years for that change to win a Super Bowl. With the Higher Education Act, we've been waiting for a formal change, although it's been tinkered with year after year by the Congress. As Sharon pointed out, HEA reauthorization probably won't happen this year. Who knows when it will happen? God knows that, but the rest of us don't. But in the meantime, there's a lot of change that's been going on despite the lack of formal change in terms of a reauthorization bill. We continue to struggle, you know, as a sector, as higher education, as a community, with declining enrollment. Last fall, 2/3 of all colleges, we're talking across all of higher education, missed their fall enrollment goals and their revenue goals. FAFSA volume was down again, nearly 3% by the end of 2019. So 7 years in a row with declining enrollments. And last year marked the 4th year in which we had a closure of for-profit campuses totaling 2,000, not in that year, but over a 4-year period. There's a private consulting group, the Parthenon Group, that says that we've got 800 private not-for-profit colleges. So this isn't just a for-profit thing. 800 private not-for-profit colleges with enrollments below 1,000 that are at risk of closure. And of course, what's happening right now around our country and around the world with the coronavirus is putting a lot of schools at risk because they're being forced to close and go online, and many of them aren't prepared to go online. Over the last 4 years, we've had mergers and consolidations in the public sector, and more of that is expected. In one article that came out in the last 2 weeks, a professor at the Iowa Grand University in Iowa said, simply holding steady is a successful outcome. So a lot of struggles that are occurring, and meanwhile, as Sharon pointed out, we've had new regulations coming out last year, some that are planned that haven't come out yet, some that did come out with the borrower defense regulation and the accreditation. Lawsuits that were filed earlier this year to challenge some of those regulations. The one lawsuit pointed at the GE rescission regulation. The other lawsuit pointed at the new borrower defense regulation. Both of those were filed in January, challenging the Secretary's authority. And meanwhile, and I'll mention this later, as Sharon pointed out, the Congress has already challenged the new borrower defense regulation, passing a resolution that has passed the Senate and the House. Hopefully President Trump will veto that resolution. We don't know. And meanwhile, we're waiting on the Title IX regulation, a new one, and a new distance education regulation, excuse me. And then we have, as Sharon recapped for us, we have a lot of new proposed legislation from the Democratic side of the aisle that's aimed at for-profits, and of course we continue to see a lot of media that's aimed at for-profits. And at the same time we have the COVID-19 crisis that we're in. And it's doubtful that we're going to have a reauthorization bill this year. I know it's a passion for Senator Alexander, but Senator Murray earlier this week said she doubts it will happen. And if she doubts it will happen, that means there's probably not going to be consensus enough in the Senate for it to happen. And given the bill that Sharon went over very well in her presentation, the CAA, the College Affordability Act, which isn't affordable at all. If you look at the cost of that bill coming out of the House, it's very doubtful it will happen. And meanwhile, at the same time, we have numerous states that are pushing anti-for-profit laws: California, New York, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, Oregon. So all of this suggests that we still don't have one clear and fair set of laws that provide federal aid on a fair basis for everyone, but we have to keep working toward it. Some bright developments are ISAs, income share agreements, that are starting to catch on. This is an alternative to loans. Of course, it requires private capital, but we're starting to see that happen. And employer scholarships, more and more employers are providing them. Skills training through apprenticeships is becoming more accepted. You see this quote from Secretary DeVos from a Latino conference that was held earlier in March in Washington. She says that we've got millions of jobs going unfilled every day that don't require a 4-year college degree, but do require some kind of education beyond high school. And fortunately, the stigma associated with technical education seems to be going away, and which speaks, well to your sector, to the things that you guys offer in the way of programs and training. And then one comment here, just earlier this month, the Secretary of the Department of Labor issued a new regulation called the IRAP regulation. Those are industry registered apprenticeship programs. You might check that out. I don't know whether any of you are interested in trying to qualify for that, but it indicates that there's going to be more focus on apprenticeships. But some of these things are things I've talked about before and have a few small changes in them, and some of them are newer. So on change reporting, this continues to be a problem in the sense that from time to time we have clients who come to us and who haven't handled changes that they've made correctly. Just remember that anytime you make a change in your operations, there should be a question in your mind about whether you need to report that to one of the 3 major regulators that you have: the state, your accrediting body, or the federal government. And if you don't report it, and you should have reported it, it could result in the interruption of your approvals at one of those 3 levels. Certainly if you have the death of a key executive or an owner, it's possible that you're going to lose approvals by not reporting it. We've had that happen with several people. So, but even basic changes to a member of the board of your directors or your executives or your third-party servicer, those are things that need to be reported on your e-app and should be reported to your other regulators as well. Campus definitions, we went through this situation recently. You can probably get away with, so to speak, with the Department of Ed adding something to your main campus, like adding nearby space, adding a floor above if you're in a large building, and adding a suite above you, a suite next door, something like that, or maybe even adding a building that is like right down the street kind of thing, as long as your accreditor recognizes that as part of your main campus. But you have to be very, very careful. You should never do that without going to your region team and asking them about it. We recently went through this situation. And as you know, major universities have campuses that are urban, that are spread out over a series of blocks, but most people in our space aren't like that. So just be very careful on that situation. Don't do it without checking with the School Participation Division, the SPD as it says here. But anytime you are going to add another structure that has a different mailing address, it's possible that the department's going to look at that as a new site that should be on your e-card. We were recently able to convince the department that a building that was across the street should be considered part of the main campus, not a new site, but it wasn't an easy discussion. Let's just put it that way. Death and divorce, even with the divorce of two owners, there can be a change in ownership, especially if the property is being transferred as part of a divorce decree. All those things have to go in front of the department. If you enter into a management agreement as part of a process where eventually the manager may be buying your school and there's a purchase option, that's something you really should be taking to your accrediting body and or to the DOE and making sure that they have a chance to review that document because they may view that as a shift towards a change in ownership. There's a change in the additional location regulation, just to tell you that if you were to acquire a campus, and I'll get to this later in the presentation, but if you were to acquire a campus that was closed from another school, the rules on that have changed a little bit. It is a reporting requirement, but there's more to it than that. It could involve you assuming liabilities for that other campus, and I'll get to that as we move forward in the program. This point here, EAP question 71, probably won't affect most of you, but just in case it ever did, you should know that there's a new emphasis on reporting gifts from foreign parties and contracts with foreign parties, where you have more than $250,000 involved. And it turns out there have been many major universities that have received billions of dollars, not just millions, billions of dollars, and haven't reported it. This has been part of the HEA for a long time, and there's the statutory reference, and so now the Secretary is pushing for this to be disclosed. So if it were to happen, if you were to enter into a contract and buy services or buy products from somebody overseas, India, China, wherever, and it involved more than $250,000 annually, it has to be reported on your EAP in Q71, and you have to report it every January 31 and July 31. All right, cohort default rates, as Sharon mentioned, they've come down on an annual basis, nationally down from 10.6 down to 10.8, last year, to 10.1 for the FY 2016 rate, which is a good development. In our sector, however, they're still high, came down from 17.19 for schools with 2-year programs or shorter, down to 17.6. So still pretty high, and still an area where we as a sector need to work. Overall, the portfolio of federal student loans that are out there is still a large portfolio, 1.51 trillion. Default prevention tools, there are a number of organizations that come to these conferences that you can consider using if you don't do it in-house, but prevention practices are important. Starts with admissions criteria, I think, and then student support that you provide for students that maybe you admit that aren't as well prepared as the ideal student. Information updates from those students so you're prepared to track them and find them, right? Entrance and exit counseling that go beyond just the mere minimum, and then keeping up with them through a third-party servicer when they go through GRACE and when they become delinquent. Here's a link to best practices on financial literacy. This is a pretty current link that the department put out recently, and then also they have a default prevention webpage at that other link. The new draft rate that just came out last month, the FY 2017 rate, is in the challenge process right now. It goes through April 17. You should always examine the underlying information that the department sends, because there are certain challenges that can only be made right now. So if you have a chance to lower that rate, this is your chance. Like if they put the wrong loan into that rate, it really belongs in a different cohort year, you have to figure that out right now. So cohort issues and loan status issues, whether the loan is really in repayment, whether it's really in default, those are things you have to figure out right now and file what's called an IDC, an incorrect data challenge right now, or a PRI challenge, which is a participation rate index challenge. You can file that later as well, but you could file it now. And you have to do that through ECDR for these IDC challenges, the ECDR, and hopefully you're all registered for that. Now, if you have the misfortune of having one rate at 30% or higher, one cohort default rate, an official final rate, you know you have to have a default management plan. If you wind up with 2 rates at that level, you have to revise the plan. And here's what, Ed put this out at the conference back in Reno in December, the FSA conference, and also in some recent guidance. Your plan that you develop when you're a school with a high rate has to do at least 5 things, right? It has to establish a default prevention team at your school. You have to conduct an analysis. analysis, that team does, to determine the sources of default risk. And then that team has to create measurable interventions to deal with the risks that are identified and steps to try to overcome those risks. And then finally, create a default prevention plan. That has to be sent, that plan, to FSA for review. And then if you have questions about this, there's an email where the questions can go. Now, the department will tell you, even if you don't have a rate that's at 30%, suppose you have a rate at 17.5% or 17.6%, which is the average right now for our sector, the department would say it's still a good idea for you to form a team and do these things. You don't have to, but it wouldn't be a bad idea. Right now, income-dependent repayment plans, I think Sharon mentioned this in her discussion. You have 8.2 million borrowers in these plans nationally, and this just means that most of these borrowers aren't paying very much more than interest because of their situation, their employment situation, how much they're earning. Borrower delinquency rates are running around 15, almost 16%, which is an improvement. Believe it or not, they would have been higher. And Sharon referred to studentaid.gov. The one good thing about studentaid.gov is students will be able to use that on that website as a tool. Summaries, they can go in there and add up, what their aid will look like at the current time and what new aid would look like, loan summaries in a simulator. They can model what their obligations will look like if they take out certain kinds of loans, obligations that they'll have right now, plus new obligations added. The other development that occurred in the loan area was in late January. The Department of Education and the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, kind of made peace and entered into an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, through which they will both share information on borrower complaints about federal private education loans and try to do a better job of helping respond to those complaints. Ed issued an updated borrower self-certification form. Are you all familiar with borrower self-certification forms? These are the forms that if you have a private education loan, if your student gets a loan from, say, like Sallie Mae, they have to bring this form to you, and you have to certify what the cost of that student's education is at your school. And believe it or not, if you make a private education loan, and you can make such a loan to your student, it's any time that you make an extension of credit for more than 12 months, where it's payable over a period of time that's more than 12 months, then you have to actually fill one of those forms out. It sounds silly, because you know what the cost is of education at your school, and the student does, but you have to fill that form out and sign it and put it in the student's file. So check that form out. It really hasn't changed from the last one. It's just an updated version, but there's the link. And then finally, just a note about loan repayment rates. As you follow the HEA debates, Sharon talked about how, unfortunately, Senator Alexander seems to be willing to allow some version of a 90-10 compromise that would allow VA funds and DOD funds to be counted in the 90-10 calculation, which is bad. He also seems to be open to the skin in the game concept of a loan repayment rate, which isn't necessarily bad if the loan repayment rate is set at a low level, but that may not happen. The thing about loan repayment rates is, on the one hand, we have all these IDR plans which Congress has created to help distressed borrowers who don't have jobs that pay a lot of money where they can pay principal, so they're just paying interest. And typically, loan repayment, requires some level of principal payment in the course of a year. So you may not have a high loan repayment rate. Your school may not, because a lot of your borrowers may be paying interest only under an IDR plan. So that's an issue. Okay, gainful employment, moving on here. The message here is, of course, that all of you, I'm sure, opted for early implementation of the rescission regulation, right? And all you had to do was write a memo and put it in your file, right? Okay, well, at the FSA conference, there was a session back in Reno in December. There was a session on institutional eligibility and things like that, and one of the presenters at that session said that if you made early implementation, and of course everybody has, that you were supposed to report it on your e-app in Q69. And nobody ever heard that before. And I was dealing with the Dallas region team on an issue recently, and I have a client that's updating their e-app to deal with this issue. And so I asked Jesse Moya, of the Dallas team, I said, is that really the truth? Is that what you guys want everyone to do, is use Q69 for this early implementation? And he said, yes. So the funny thing about this is it's March, right? And we still don't have any electronic announcement from the department. And come July 1 of this year, early implementation is moot. It's no longer needed. So take that for what it's worth. But if you have some reason to be doing an update to your electronic application for any reason, adding program information or something, go ahead and open up Q69 and note that you opted for early implementation back on whatever date it was, July 1, July 2, you filled out a memo to file and you opted for it, and you've been operating that way ever since. Of course, schools that don't opt for it are still subject to GE reporting and disclosures. The other thing is, if you go to, and Sharon's talked to us earlier today about the fact that there's an FSA school data, this says data, it should be data webpage, and that FSA school data webpage has all kinds of useful information and some not so useful information about schools on it. And it has a GE rates spreadsheet there. So if you go there, you can still pull up your GE rates for the award year 2015. So they're still out there, even though GE is like no longer applicable. It's going to be gone. Although, on the other hand, there is still this lawsuit I told you about earlier. It was filed by the AFT, that is the American Federation of Teachers, and the California Federation of Teachers. It was filed in San Francisco Federal Court. Of course, where else would you file things but in a liberal bastion like San Francisco? And it challenges the rulemaking process on that regulation that rescinds the GE regulation. So stay tuned, but right now at least, GE is gone. All right, borrower defense. So where are we with borrower defense? I know Sharon talked about it, and I'll try to skip through this quickly. We're under the Obama BDR reg, but the Secretary doesn't seem too committed to enforcing it vigorously. But I will talk about, Sharon talked about the differences on pre-dispute arbitration agreements. And I'm going to quickly look at some of the other aspects of comparing Obama's regulation to Trump's regulation. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lawsuit attacking the new regulation, and I mentioned also what it says here on point 2 about the Congressional Relief Act resolution passed by the House and by the Senate, which effectively would overturn the new BDR regulation, the Trump regulation, unless President Trump vetoes it, which is expected. So where we are right now is technically we're under the Obama regulation, but we hope the Trump regulation will become effective July 1, 2020, we hope. The Obama regulation was made effective even though the Secretary tried to set it aside in 2019. It was made effective by a ruling in this lawsuit, Bauer versus DeVos. So the Obama regulation creates the federal standard on loan discharges. The same is true of the Trump regulation. The Obama standard is a lot more relaxed. The Obama standard does require reasonable reliance by a student on misleading information, materially misleading information from the school, but it doesn't require intent by the school, doesn't require a statute of limitations, doesn't provide one, and we think it has loose language on causation. The Trump regulation, on the other hand, it, like the Obama regulation, requires misrepresentation of a material fact concerning enrollment or education services. And it requires that that misrepresentation by a school be made with knowledge of the situation or reckless disregard for the truth, reasonable reliance by a borrower, and that the borrower was financially harmed as a result. That's causation. And then finally, here are some of the misrepresentation areas. So the key difference is that the Trump regulation requires that there be a causal relationship between the misrepresentation and harm that the borrower has suffered. And the other thing is that there is a statute of limitations, a 3-year statute of limitations. It's not open-ended forever. The way the Obama regulation is set up, the student could come in 5 years, 6 years later and assert a claim and ask to have their loan forgiven. Loan discharge claims to date, there have been over 300,000 of them filed. 25,000 were ruled ineligible, 8,000 were closed, and 51,000 have been approved. Okay, so that leaves over 200,000 that are still pending. 535 million, okay, has already been granted in loan discharges. Of course, a lot of those for Corinthian and for ITT. So a lot has been paid out already. In November, the department issued an electronic announcement and said it would start sending notices of BDR claims through its PEP system, the Post-Secondary Education Participant System. And when you get a notice, you'll have 30 days to respond to a BDR notice. In other words, that some student has filed a claim against your school, they want their loan forgiven. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands here as to how many of you have gotten those notices, but you'll be getting them. Closed school discharges are different from BDR claim notices, okay? This is where if you close your school and students have been given an opportunity to seek to have their loans forgiven because the school closed and they weren't able to complete their program. That's a whole other story. But here's the math on that. Over the last 4 years, or actually 6 years, from November 2013 to December 2019, you've had over 31,000 borrowers that have had $347 million in loans forgiven for closed school discharges. So there's some overlap probably between the BDR claims and the closed school claims. Borrower defense summary here, pre-dispute arbitration claims. This is what Sharon talked about earlier. The main thing I want to point out here is that you can use these arbitration clauses for non-BDR claims. What's a non-BDR claim? Well, I think sexual harassment would be a good example. So if you have a student who claims they were sexually harassed by another student, or they were sexually harassed by an instructor, that doesn't have anything to do with representations that were made to them about whether or not your school is a great school and they ought to go to your school. It doesn't have anything to do with representations made about educational services. So if you have an arbitration clause in your contract that carves out, BDR claims and says that the student's agreeing to arbitrate claims like that, or slip and fall claims, like the student slips on the premises and they have to arbitrate that. But be very careful with that language. Check with a lawyer. Make sure that it's carefully focused only on non-BDR claims. And right now, you're under the Obama reg. The Obama reg prohibits any use of arbitration, without student consent. And, if you're going to ask for student consent, then you have to make it clear that they have the right to absolutely refuse to sign that. And that gets pretty hairy to make sure that it's informed consent. So the safest approach is to not use arbitration clauses right now until July 1, 2020. All right, mandatory LOC triggers under the Obama reg compared to those under the Trump reg. We'll get to it in a second. The bottom line is there's more mandatory triggers with the Obama reg than there are with the Trump reg. And the other thing is these mandatory triggers under the Obama reg, and the Secretary hasn't been enforcing these to my knowledge. Again, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands and ask if any of you have gotten a letter, but if you had 2 consecutive 30% CDRs, you should be getting a letter saying, give us a 10% letter of credit. Or if your last 90-10 score was over 90%, you should be getting a letter saying, give us a 10% letter of credit. And then if your financial responsibility, your composite score, was adjusted so that it was below 1.0 due to, then it says a failing GE rate. And I think technically the AY 2015 rates, when they were published, maybe are still effective, even though GE was later rescinded. They're out there, so I don't know. But in any event, if you had a lawsuit filed by students, agencies, or others, and the amount of claim damages in that lawsuit were assumed to be recovered at some point, and then you go back and recalculate your composite score based on having to pay out those damages, and your rate's under 1, then the Secretary would come to you and ask for a 10% letter of credit. So these are all mandatory triggers, right? And then you have all these discretionary triggers. It's a long list. I'm not going to try to discuss all of those. But each of these things, like getting a show cause from your creditor, being put on probation by your creditor, could be another reason for a 10% letter of credit. And under the Obama reg, they can stack all these, so you could wind up with a 50% letter of credit. Contrast that with the Trump reg. There's only 2 things here that really are mandatory. And then the third item on the list is simply having 2 discretionary triggers that would add up to a mandatory trigger for what could be a letter of credit or could be other things. The 2 mandatory things are if you're a school, a for-profit school, and you have a comp score that's already under 1.5 and you withdraw equity, you take out dividends, then you have to put up a letter of credit. Or if you're any kind of school, for-profit, non-profit, whatever, and you've incurred a liability that leads to a final settlement or a final judgment. And when we go and apply that final settlement and judgment to your comp score, it leads to a comp score under 1.0, then you have to put up a letter of credit. Now, discretionary things under the Trump reg, similar list to what we had under the Obama reg. Accreditation show cause, a loan default under a loan agreement, state agency notice telling you that they're looking to potentially withdraw your license, a 90-10 failure in your most recent year. Notice that under the Obama reg, 90-10 failure was a mandatory trigger. Here it's discretionary. Last two CDRs at 30% plus, that was a mandatory trigger with Obama. It's discretionary trigger with Trump. And then high annual dropout rates. In each case, if you have these things, you have to report them within 10 days. Okay, the response. Now, under the Trump reg, the response is more flexible. You can respond to the secretary once you're aware of these events by being able to show that maybe the information's wrong. There really wasn't a triggering event. Or you can demonstrate that the triggering event doesn't have a material adverse effect on your school. Or you can show that you've got insurance in place that will cover the risk. Okay, that's a way of showing that the school students aren't going to be harmed. And then finally, if you can't do any of those things, you can post a letter of credit, 10% plus provisional certification or 50%. So if you do those things, then hopefully you won't wind up down in the bottom bullet points here. And those bottom bullet points are being asked to provide a personal guarantee and maybe other financial protection, which could be more collateral, or being exposed to what's called an L&T action, limitation, suspension, and termination. And then exposure to that action could lead to termination of your Title IV. All right, financial responsibility. The bottom line is the department still uses HCM very liberally. There were 478 schools on heightened cash monitoring as of December 1 of last year. For all the reasons that you see there, primarily late and missing audits, program reviews, change in ownership, and low comp scores. Mostly HCM1. Out of that list, I think that only about 65 of those schools were on heightened cash monitoring too. But HCM1 has its own pain, as you know. You have to pay out credit balances when you're on HCM1. You can't ask those students to waive them and allow you to hold the credit balance. And of course, it's records first. You have to post to the student's ledger into COD before you order the money. But HCM2 is really a brutal place to be. And this information comes off of that school data center website that Sharon mentioned. You can also find there a spreadsheet with letters of credit. So the most recent data is from the 16 to 17 award year, but as of that point in time, there were 474 schools that had letters of credit on file. I'm going to skip forward here, and we already talked about dispersing credit balances, HCM2. As anybody in this room that's ever been on it, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. You know that when you first get on it and get set up, often you have your initial batch rejected for errors. The department doesn't like the way you presented the information on the spreadsheet or the back of the documentation. I've worked with several schools on this, and they usually hire an outside consultant, and they still get rejections. So it's a really bad place to be. The other thing about this is that if you go through a program review and the department thinks some serious issue has been identified in that program review, usually student eligibility or student attendance records, you could be switched to HCM2 and you won't have a chance to respond to that serious issue and try to make it go away for many, many months. I've seen this happen time and time again. So, you need to be in a position where you can survive for 60 to 90 days without Title IV cash. And that's not telling you anything you don't know. It's not like a brilliant insight. It's just a reality. Try to put yourself in that position if you're not there now, to have a line of credit and or have cash in the bank. That's just the reality. And Gregory's here, and he's worked with me on some clients. He knows the reality of that fact. All right, financial statement review. We're seeing the department being more willing to challenge auditors and schools on financial statement items and accounting, and basically turn what would be a compliance score like 1.8 into a non-compliance score like 1.2 and make you put up a letter of credit. You can appeal those decisions if you think they're wrong, and you can prove it through GAAP and through maybe an expert consultant or something. But that's part of what is going on right now. If you wind up turning in an audit and your auditor leaves something off in a footnote or something, and then you catch it after the fact, the department catches it, and you file a correction late, that's a late audit. A late audit is going to result in you having to do something like heightened cash monitoring, one usually, and maybe provisional certification. So the message here is don't wait until the end of the audit period to schedule your audit. I mean, too many people that have a December 31 year end are having their audits done in June or in May, and then that means your filing gets done toward the end of the audit filing period, and then you discover that you left something out of the footnote. I've seen it happen, and people wind up correcting that, like they file it on like July 15, the correction. Well, now you have a late audit because the original one was filed timely, but it wasn't complete. It could be something ministerial in nature, so you just don't want to be there. Moving on. Oh, I'm going to skip over the long-term debt. I think most of you heard Eileen talk about this, but the bottom line is long-term debt for purposes of composite score is only debt, long-term debt that you actually use to buy property, plant, and equipment. It's not long-term debt that you can say I can connect it to property, plant, and equipment. I've got $1 million in a line of credit here, and I don't have to pay it off for 15 months, so it's long-term debt. You actually have to show you used the $1 million to buy property, plant, and equipment. You have to have invoices and documentation. That's the new rule. That becomes effective July 1. And then lease accounting, you've all heard a lot about this, but for all leases that are entered on or after December 15 of 2018, you're going to have to count for that lease on your balance sheet now, real estate leases for your campuses. And that will affect your composite score. All right, past performance. This continues to be an issue. I just went through this with a client in the southeastern portion of the United States. It includes not only the obvious controlling people like the CEO of a company, a member of the board of directors, and someone who owns 25% or more of the equity, but it can include people who have a title like vice president, even though in a big company, a vice president doesn't really have control, and that was the case with this particular client that we helped out. This was one of several vice presidents serving below a group of higher executives, and they came to this particular school and said, that vice president's a controlling person at your school, and oh, by the way, that vice president was at another school where he was a controlling person, and he was on the board, and that other school closed, and they have a $2 million program review liability. So, since he's at your school and he's a controlling person, your school has to pay the $2 million if you want to remain financially responsible. End of story. Well, we ultimately negotiated over a period of time. We protested, et cetera, et cetera. That person had to change his position at the school he's at now, so he would no longer be viewed as a controlling person. So when you hire someone, the message here for you is when you hire someone, first of all, find out whether they were on the E-card at a school that closed. If they were on the E-card, they're going to be viewed as a controlling person, bottom line. But ask whether or not they were a member of the board, were they a CEO, did they have stock, were they a 25% owner, because Ed is going to connect them. With so many schools closing, I told you the school closure number earlier, you know, so many schools closing and so many of them owing liabilities and not able to pay them when they close. This is an important question for you. The second area that's important, of course, is taking over space that was used by a closed school. We now seem to have gotten into a little more rationality. The region team will, if you go to them, they will gather information from you about the campus that you want to take over that's closed. And as long as you're dealing only with a commercial landlord, you're not taking any assets, maybe there's some junk that was left in the space, the vacated space, junk left there by the former school that closed, tell them to get rid of the junk. You don't want it, because the junk may look like assets that you're taking from another school. So you don't want any assets, get rid of the junk. And you'll have to answer some questions for the region team. We've been through this now multiple times with different region teams, and as long as you answer all their questions and assure them you're not paying any money to anyone connected to the former school, only dealing with a commercial landlord, only entering into a commercial lease, you'll finally get a sign-off from the region team that you won't have to pay any of the liabilities of the closed school. But make sure you do it that way. All right, teach-outs and campus closures. 1,400 institutions, 1,400 campuses that closed. I don't know how many institutions, for-profit campuses. And there's a lot of concern about abrupt closures, and the reality is the department is responsible for a lot of those abrupt closures because of the way they cut off Title IV. So one of the things that came out of the last round of rulemaking is this change to the what we call the closeout regulations at 34 CFR 660 at 26E. So you now have the opportunity, if you're a school that's facing the worst case scenario, you're going to have to close. You could get up to 120 days of Title IV aid after loss of your Title IV eligibility, but only under some very, very narrow, limited circumstances. So if you have like an accrediting body that's going to cut off your accreditation, they'd be willing to defer the effective date of that cutoff for 120 days and allow you to teach out, as it were, in place, teach out some of your students. The requirement is that you have to be able to show that students you're going to award aid to are going to be able to complete their program at your school, or they're going to be able to transfer to another school and complete the program there. If they meet that criteria, then you can award aid to them during that 120-day period. So it's a little bit of a lifeline, not a big one, but it's some help. Now, the other thing that happens here with teach-outs for closing schools is that students have to be given the right, they have to be given notice that they have the right to choose loan forgiveness instead of your teach-out. So this is a real problem. If you're closing a campus, and this is still kind of up in the air, what if you're closing just a campus, not a whole school, and you're offering your students the opportunity to have their program taught out, they'll finish their program at the campus you're closing, or you're offering to have them transfer over to a nearby campus, maybe that's 10 miles away, and finish the program there. Under this regulation, the way it's been rewritten, particularly in the Obama regulation, the one that's there right now, you would have to tell them that they have the right to choose loan forgiveness instead of this teach-out. And this is still up in the air about this thing. I haven't gotten a clear answer on this. So this is not a good regulation, because where you're just teaching out a campus, not the whole school closing, and the student has the right to finish the program clearly on the same terms, stay at the campus, they shouldn't have the opportunity to say, I want my loan forgiven, I don't want to finish the program. So if I were you, if you're in that situation where you're going to close the campus, but you're going to teach everybody out, I would go to the region team right away and get this clarified and ask them to confirm that you can just finish teaching out every student at that campus and then close it, and that you don't have to give notice to any of your students that they have a right to have their loan forgiven. And get that confirmed in writing. The rest of the stuff that's on this slide would be primarily applicable if you were closing your whole school, which is make sure you give notice to all your regulators, make sure you think about insurance and whether or not you have coverage against student claims and lawsuits, figure out what you're going to do with your records. You have to notify your regulators where the records are going, and of course prepare for a closeout audit. Bankruptcy, you never want to elect that as an option until you've taken all steps that might be available to pass your school on to someone else, to a white knight, to a buyer, something like that. The one thing about bankruptcy is to try to prepare your school. If you have multiple partners, prepare your school to avoid bankruptcy that could come about from one of your shareholders. In other words, make sure that you don't have a personal bankruptcy filed by a shareholder or partner who's out there and got personal problems, because anytime an owner of a school files a bankruptcy, that can result in the school losing its Title IV aid. So this is just sort of a good housekeeping preparatory thing. Additional locations, I told you earlier that we would talk about this, time allowing, and we do have some time. Additional locations under that regulation is 600.32, it's mentioned here on the slide, has changed. The bottom line is that if you take over a closed site and you don't do a teach-out, you just take over the closed site, and that location potentially has liabilities from current prior year, you could be held responsible for those liabilities in taking over that site. But if you do a teach-out and the teach-out is approved by everybody, and you don't have any common ownership, management, and that school ceased operations, then you clearly won't have any liabilities for that location. Now, this is where you take over the location with students in place. If you take over the location with students in place without doing a teach out, that's where you have problems. Now, if you're just taking over vacant space a year later or 2 years later, you're not going to be exposed to liability. So this regulation addresses itself, 600.32, really to a situation where you have a live campus with individuals in place. And the key about teach-outs, of course, is equitable treatment, meaning students are going to get the same terms under the teach-out that they would have had if their school had stayed open. So a little bit of a complicated area. The good news about the change in the regulation is that the white knight status is normally going to be available because every school that's closing is going to cease operations, and that was the original intent. Incentive compensation, I think the main thing here that's new is that the OIG issued some guidance last year in July, basically saying that they expect to see auditors doing sampling of compensation records and looking at how covered people are admissions personnel and of course financial aid personnel, how they're compensated and whether or not there's any incentives involved at all. And the points on this screen aren't new, they've been here before, but you know, if you wanted to take the low risk approach, you wouldn't make any changes in the compensation of your covered personnel other than cost of living or something that's tenure based, where every year that you're here, you'll get a bump in your compensation. Everybody gets it, tenure based. So those are the safest things to do. And then any kind of a promotion where they actually take on more responsibilities. Those would be the safest approaches to use. But if you actually want to have annual reviews, then the annual review should focus on obviously not on success in covered activity, but it should be a process review. And a process review is simply, you give your covered personnel a certain process to follow, certain kinds of information they should be using with prospective students in the case of admissions representative. You want to find out whether they're following the process. How do you find that out? You use surveys maybe, student surveys. Maybe you listen in on phone calls, or maybe you spend money for shoppers. And through that process, you figure out whether they're doing what you ask them to do. Graduation bonuses can also be thrown into the mix now. You can track a cohort of students that are recruited and see how many of them graduate. And so the main thing here is don't compensate people who are covered based on success in the job that they're actually doing. I know it's counterproductive, counterintuitive, but that's just the way it is. And this slide just tells you to keep your records about success, management records, separate from your compensation records. And when you're using a third party, make sure that the third party under a third party servicer agreement or an MSA is obligated to follow the same rules you are with respect to incentive compensation. Make sure they're also obligated to indemnify you if they break the rules and your school gets fined, which could happen. Okay, student eligibility. High school diplomas aren't necessarily any more of a problem today than they ever have been, but last July, the department did issue what they call the Safe Harbor electronic announcement. And this announcement basically said that anytime you have reason to doubt the validity of a high school diploma, you need a written policy that would guide what your staff should do. And this is just basically reiterating the guidance that's been there since 2009 when we had the program integrity regulations that came out. So you have to get documents from the school in question, the secondary school that issued the student's diploma, and confirm that the student actually does have a diploma. And then you have to confirm the validity of that secondary school through the state agency in the state in question, confirm that it's a real secondary school. And just from prior guidance that I've been including in my slides, when you put this policy into your catalog, your school catalog, it should tell a prospective student when you're going to actually review a high school diploma. And I think, you know, it should be based on some red flags, and red flags ought to be criteria that, you know, identifies certain things that are more suspect than others. So any online diploma probably is a red flag, because you never know, online schools are more susceptible to fraud. So anytime you're presented an online diploma, you ought to be checking it out. Anytime you're presented an out-of-state diploma, you should be checking it out. Anytime you're presented a diploma where the dates look odd, they don't match up with the student's birth date and things like that, you should be checking it out. And then your policy that you put in your catalog ought to have the steps that you're going to use for vetting a diploma. How are we going to check it out? We're going to go to the State Department of Education. We're going to go to the website for that high school. Maybe we're going to go to the region team. So lay all of that out. And when you do that, you're going to be in better shape. The bottom line is if you use this kind of a policy based on this safe harbor that was just issued last summer, I think there's less of a likelihood that you'll wind up having to pay back Title IV money. For out-of-the-country diplomas, you should use a specialist firm, a firm that's been recognized by the department, and there's a couple of names on this slide. And with GED certificates, you should always confirm those, that they were really issued by a state agency, that they're valid, because there's been some fraud there as well. And then finally, if you have special criteria for admissions, whether it's passing an admissions test or prerequisite, make sure that the student file confirms that the student has met those. All right, cybersecurity. And I've got about 10, 15 minutes max left. Cybersecurity, Sharon talked about this. There was an electronic announcement that was issued at the end of February. And it was issued directed to auditors, but it was directed to auditors about you guys. And auditors now have to make sure that schools have strong security policies and effective internal controls. And so there are three things that auditors are supposed to do when they come to your school. Number one, determine that you have actually got, excuse me, I think I went too far, that you've got an information security program coordinator. Okay? That means you don't have to go out and hire a CIO, a Chief Information Officer, but you must have someone on your staff who you've designated as your Information Security Program Coordinator, just like you have to have someone on your staff designated as your Title IX Coordinator. Okay? Someone who has the responsibility for the flow of information at your school. And then secondly, that person should oversee an effort to assess all risk to PII, personally identifiable information, risk associated with employee training, with information systems, risk involving detection, prevention, and response to attacks, intrusions, or system failures. And then when you're done with that effort, which should be done annually, then you should be developing safeguards to respond to any risk that were identified in that assessment, right? And those safeguards have to be reasonable. So if your auditor comes in and he doesn't find that you've done those three things, that you failed in any area, the auditor has to make a finding, and I think Sharon mentioned that. The finding goes over to the FTC, but that finding will also go over to Ed's cybersecurity team. And Ed's cybersecurity team will review it, and they think it's serious. They can pass it on to the AAASG, that's the Administrative Appeals and Security School Group, excuse me, and they can cite you or recommend that you be sanctioned in some way. So there's a lot more to this than that, and I'm going to go over a few more points, but the primary thing is get your information security coordinator, make sure you've done an annual assessment, identify risk, and make sure you develop some safeguards. This is serious stuff for the department because there have been more and more intrusions and breaches of information all around. So what this slide tells you is that there's hardly a program review anymore where there isn't a finding in this area. If you do suffer a breach of student information where you learn that some PII has somehow been released inadvertently and you don't report it to the department, that will be a black mark for you. It really will. The department sends out letters when they learn about this, and they will warn you that they potentially will issue a fine. I've had a client that got one of these letters, so that's how I know about it. And you're responsible not only for what you yourself do in this area, but for what your third-party contractors, your TPP does. So here's the slide on what you have to do. If you learn about a breach of PII, you have to give notice to the students or employees who were affected. In some states, you have to notify the Attorney General, local authorities, and here's who you notify at the department. There's the email address to send it to. And what do you have to report? The date of the breach, the impact, what was affected, the method of the breach. Was it being hacked, or was it just somebody inadvertently leaving information somewhere? What did you do to remediate the breach? and who's the point of contact at your school. If you have cyber coverage under your insurance policy, you should notify your broker or carrier. And of course, if you fail to notify yet, you're at risk of being administratively sanctioned or fined. And here's some websites where you can get information on good cyber practices. This is through the department. Okay, as Sharon mentioned, informed borrowing confirmation, which will go into effect next month in April, and so this is just a reminder about that. It's a good idea because I think you're all interested in trying to limit borrowing, right? What a great idea to remind students and parents how much they've already borrowed before they get their next disbursement. Now this applies in the first disbursement that they're going to get under their first loan in a given award year. Some reminders from Ed. This came out late last year. In disbursement reporting, some of you fall down on the job and you don't report in COD as you should within 15 days of making a disbursement. Some of you also fall down on your reconciliations. COD disbursements should be reconciled internally, monthly, between the financial aid office and the bursar or the business office, and externally, they should be reconciled monthly as well between school data and COD data. And how do we know that doesn't happen? We know in program review findings and also in annual compliance audit findings. And then excess cash, a reminder as well there, when funds are received in your federal account, they're supposed to be dispersed by the end of the 3rd business day. Okay, and there is a tolerance over the course of a year where you have excess cash. It can't exceed more than 1% of what your prior year drawdown was. But again, that's a finding that's often made on program reviews. But on this program career fact sheet, there's an example here for you. The point of this is that disclosures are really important to your students, and if you use a program career fact sheet, even though you're not required to do it, you'll have essential information that you hand out to each prospective student, including licensure requirements for the program that you're teaching for, and you'll have it all there in black and white, and so hopefully that will counteract any hyperbole that an admissions rep might be inclined to do and keep them on script. It's just a good idea to use, especially in this age of BDR, reg, and exposure to having loans forgiven because of materially misleading representations. And this is an example of a fact sheet. I know it's small, and if any of you want to blow up at this, just send me, you've got my email address, send me an email and I'll send you a blow up of it. All right, distance education disclosures. I think Sharon mentioned that you now have to you have to be able to show that you're licensed in every state where you have a student located. If you're online, located is the buzzword now. It just means where the student's living. And you have to make that determination when they enroll. Or if they change where they're located and you get information to that effect, you have to make that determination. And so you have to either be licensed or exempt in a state. That's one way to handle this, where they're located. Or you can be a member of SARA or some other group, but SARA is the prevailing one. They're in all 49 states except California and DC. And SARA is the State Authorization Reciprocity Association. The new disclosure requirements, and Sharon went over these, but this is really critical, and this is both for on-ground and online schools. You need to, for a program that you're teaching that leads to licensure, you need to be able to disclose to your students every state that the student that you know is in the state. And like if you have a brick and mortar school, but it's right on the border of New Jersey and New York, you have to be able to tell that student whether you meet the requirements in New Jersey and New York. And if you don't, then you have to tell them that. Or if you haven't made a determination about New Jersey or New York, you have to tell them that. But you better not be in that 3rd category, because not knowing is not a good thing. Because you're enrolling a student without knowing what your program does or doesn't do, and how it doesn't meet the requirements of state, you could be open to a lawsuit. So this is really critical. Second disclosure point was if you're subject to a serious enforcement action by a state or federal agency, you need to tell your students. And if you are required to calculate placement outcomes for an accreditor, or if you're using placement information in your advertising, you have to disclose that in writing as well. Credit transfer policies, you now have to disclose those in writing to all prospective students. So these are all important points. Student integrity, if you're online, you have to have a viable process for making sure that the student who registers is the student who's actually logging on and academically engaged. Growth, your accreditors now have to monitor your growth, particularly where there's a 50% enrollment increase in any year over year. They have to report that within 30 days to the department after they determine that to exist. All right, coronavirus, this slide tells you that the pandemic is really bad, and this is the latest information as of yesterday. Here in the States, it keeps changing as it does around the world every hour. So over 3,200 cases in the United States, nearly 70 deaths, numerous schools going online. There's now almost 30 million K through 12 students that are going online. Their districts are closed. The department issued this guidance at the link at the bottom of this slide on March the 5th. Some commentators are calling this maybe a black swan event for online meeting. Maybe it will forever change the way we think about online. Maybe it'll become more accepted, more prevalent, because we're being forced to use online. I guess the issue is, should you go online? Can you go online? Collaborate with your local health officials about whether you ought to suspend, postpone. I wrote this at the beginning of last week, or this week, and now I think this is all moot. I think the reality is that if you're in a state where they tell you that 50 or more people shouldn't be meeting, maybe you have to suspend classes. And if you can go online with your education, you'll do it. But the fact of the matter is you may not be able to meet just because of the nature of the governmental orders that are out there. The department is going to allow you to go online if your accrediting body allows you to go online, and your state and the state licensure bodies for your programs that you teach. So whether you can adapt, I mean, you don't need an LMS. This slide here, let me see if I can get to it, tells you that you might consider using a temporary consortium agreement with other schools that have DE as one option. This slide down here talks about alternatives to a platform. Most of you may not have an LMS or a big platform like Blackboard or something like that to use, but maybe you can use these smaller programs like Flipgrid, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, conference calls, some alternative methodology through which you can collectively meet with a group of your students to review assignments, and maybe you can do didactic work. And I understand if you're teaching cosmetology or massage therapy, you can't do that online, the practical aspects of it. And maybe you can meet in smaller groups and do some of that stuff with those students individually, but you may have to suspend operations for a period of 30 days and not have the practical side of things. We're in an unprecedented crisis in our nation, as many other nations are around the world. So it calls for unique steps to be taken, and I would say coordinate that with your state licensing body as well as with your accrediting body. And the department, I think, is going to give us as much slack as it can. So in the March 5th guidance, this slide talks about LOAs and terms, fashioning non-standard terms. If you have to close, requesting temporary reduction in the length of your academic year, professional judgment and SAP, being able to alter costs that students may have. Ed did say they couldn't change enrollment status in R2T4, but they're seeking flexibility on that as well right now. But the temporary approval to offer distance ed, I mean, Ed wants you to have that as long as you can get it from your accrediting body. And I did have a slide in here on a few of the creditors that we looked at early last week. ABHES, we were told, would be flexible on a case-by-case basis. Asset, we couldn't get a statement from when we checked. ACCSC wanted temporary notices about people opting to go online. NACIS wanted you to show that you had a government shutdown order or you had a student who was quarantined. Of course, all of this is literally changing, as you can imagine, day by day. So you have to keep checking in with these people. Here's a slide that has an article out of the Chronicle with some tips about going online in a hurry. And here are a couple of providers, LMS providers, about going online in a hurry. And then here's an email address where you can email the department for guidance on Title IV and coronavirus. Don't forget insurance. Now, keep in mind, insurance carriers around the world are being just totally slammed right now with all kinds of big dollar claims as a result of COVID-19. So don't think it'll be easy to get coverage, but you should be. If you think you have coverage under a CGL, a comprehensive general liability policy, you should be putting your carrier on notice. And one big area is BI, business interruption. So if your business is being interrupted, you're having to close and or go online, suspend classes, and you're not getting revenue. That's business interruption big time. There's never been a more classic definition of business interruption. So put your carriers on notice, whatever coverage you have. Surely you all have at least, I hope you do, a CGL, a comprehensive general liability policy. Put them on notice and let them know that you intend to submit a claim.
Go back 2 slides back.
Yeah.
And the top item is not the first one. Go back one. Yeah, the first one. This is not available, just locked out.
This is guidance. This is out of the March 5 guidance that the department put out. In that guidance, the department said that DE, distance education, would not be available for clock hour courses leading to licensure if the licensure body was not giving DE credits. So, for example, you have students who are going to go sit for an exam, let's say an LPN exam, and you teach LPN, and LPN's a clock hour program, and it's an NCLEX exam they have to take, and let's say that they're supposed to complete 1,200 clock hours, and the party administering, the Board of Nursing or whatever, says, we're not going to recognize any hours that were taken online. That would be your hurdle to get over. So that's something to take up with the department, but right now the department's saying we're not going to give you Title IV money if you go online for a program like that and the licensure body is not recognizing hours that are earned through distance education. You haven't been able to get them to back down. So you want to go to that state licensure body and ask them, hey, look, we're in a crisis. We're shifting online so students can keep learning. Will you please, relax this rule right now during the coronavirus crisis? Okay, with all of that, I apologize, but I have to run in order to make my flight. It's been good being with you.